Everyone's heard about World War II deceptions, the fake armies, the inflatable tanks, the double agents feeding the enemy false intelligence, but almost no one has heard about what happened in Sicily in the summer of 1943. A group of American Army engineers took an entire operational airfield, one with real planes, real runways, real fuel depots, real personnel, and made it vanish. Not partially, not from a distance, completely. So thoroughly that German reconnaissance aircraft flew directly over it, photographed it, returned to base, and reported nothing. No airfield, just scrubland, just dust, just the same featureless Sicilian terrain that stretched for kilometers in every direction. They did it in 36 hours. And here's the part that still feels almost impossible to believe. It worked. The Luftwaffe never found it. Operations continued. Planes took off and landed. Missions were flown. And the Germans, who were desperately searching for Allied airfields to bomb into rubble, looked straight down at it from altitude and saw absolutely nothing worth targeting. This is not a story people tell. It doesn't have the glamour of Operation Fortitude or the famous Ghost Army with its inflatable Sherman tanks. It doesn't have a Hollywood ending or a famous general claiming credit. It's a story about engineers, about painters and artisans and net weavers and soil chemists, about people who looked at a flat piece of North African scorched earth and figured out how to make a lie so convincing that the world's most technically advanced air force in Europe flew right over it and believed every inch of it. Stick with this one, because the details are where it gets extraordinary. And if you want more stories like this, the ones the history books somehow keep skipping over, subscribe now. We find the ones that deserve to be told. To understand why camouflaging an entire airfield mattered so much, you have to understand what Sicily meant in July of 1943. This was Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, the first major Allied assault on what Churchill famously called the soft underbelly of Europe. After months of grinding desert warfare in North Africa, after the long, brutal slog from El Alamein to Tunisia, the Allies had finally cleared the continent. Now they were crossing the Mediterranean, now they were taking the fight to European soil for the first time. And the stakes could not have been higher. The invasion force was enormous, nearly 180,000 troops, thousands of vehicles, more than 3,000 aircraft operating in support. The airfields in Sicily would become the lifeblood of the campaign. Without air superiority, without the ability to keep Allied planes in the sky over the invasion beaches and the advancing ground forces, everything would fall apart. The Germans knew this, the Luftwaffe knew this, and they had reconnaissance aircraft working overtime, flying grid patterns over every inch of Sicily, looking for exactly the kind of infrastructure the Allies were frantically building. This was the problem. You can't fight a modern air war without airfields, and you can't hide airfields. Or at least, that was the conventional wisdom before a group of American engineers decided to test it. The German reconnaissance operation over Sicily was sophisticated. The Luftwaffe was using high-altitude aircraft, primarily variants of the Junkers Ju-88 and the Heinkel Heer 111, modified for reconnaissance work, some flying so high that Allied fighters struggled to intercept them in time. These planes carried precision cameras capable of producing extraordinarily detailed photographs. A skilled photo analyst on the ground could look at an aerial photograph and identify individual vehicles, estimate troop concentrations, calculate the dimensions of runways, and determine whether a field was operational or under construction. Photo reconnaissance was arguably the most important intelligence-gathering tool of the entire war. Both sides invested massively in it, and when you understood what German photo analysts were looking for, you understood both the difficulty and the elegance of what the American engineers eventually accomplished. German analysts were trained to spot several key signatures of an airfield. The first was the physical texture of a prepared landing surface. Even a dirt airstrip, properly graded and compacted for aircraft operations, had a characteristic appearance from altitude. The soil was disturbed. It was compacted into smooth strips. The edges were distinct. You could see the difference between a prepared surface and surrounding natural terrain even in a black and white photograph taken from 10,000 feet. The second signature was the geometry. Airfields had patterns, parallel taxiways, hard stands arranged in predictable configurations. Fuel and ammunition dumps placed at specific distances from runways for safety reasons. Dispersal areas where aircraft were spread out to minimize the damage from a single bombing run. These were not random layouts. They followed logic, and that logic was visible from the air. The third signature was the shadow profile of aircraft. Even when planes were dispersed and camouflaged individually, their shapes cast recognizable shadows at certain times of day. A photo analyst who knew what to look for could spot a fighter aircraft tucked under netting or tree cover by nothing more than the shadow its tail assembly cast at a low sun angle. And the fourth signature, perhaps the most difficult to eliminate, was activity. Supply trucks leaving and arriving, personnel moving between structures, the trails left by tire tracks in soil, the disturbance patterns around fuel points. A busy airfield was a living organism, and living organisms left marks. The engineers assigned to solve this problem needed to eliminate all four of these signatures simultaneously, for an airfield that was already operational, with planes flying in and out of it, while a land battle was unfolding 15 kilometers away. The unit tasked with this work was part of the Army Corps of Engineers, specifically a detachment with specialized training in camouflage that had been developed partly in response to lessons learned in the North African campaign. These were not ordinary combat engineers. They had been trained by people with backgrounds in theater, in film production, in architecture, in art. The Army, to its great credit, had figured out early in the war that the skills needed for military camouflage were not military skills at all. They were artistic and scientific skills, and they had recruited accordingly. The camouflage schools established in the United States drew on professors of fine art, stage designers, architectural professors who understood how light interacts with structure, and industrial designers who could think systematically about mass-produced deception. These unusual recruits were then filtered down into units like the one that found itself standing in a dusty Sicilian field in the summer of 1943, staring at a runway and trying to figure out how to make it disappear. The commanding officer of the camouflage detachment, working under the broader engineering command structure, gathered his team on the first day and told them something that shaped everything that followed. He said they were not trying to hide the airfield from someone looking for it. They were trying to make it look like something that someone would not bother looking at twice. That was the distinction. Hiding implies concealment, and concealment implies something is there to be found. What he wanted was substitution. He wanted the field to look like it had always been something else. The plan had 4 components, and each one was more technically demanding than it sounds when described simply. The first component was surface treatment. The problem with a compacted dirt runway is that compacted dirt looks nothing like the surrounding scrubland. In Sicily in summer, the landscape was a mixture of dry grass, exposed limestone outcroppings, scattered low brush, reddish-brown soil, and the particular kind of patchy, irregular terrain that develops when grazing animals have been working an area for generations. A runway cut through all of that. It was a geometric scar on an irregular landscape. The solution required what the engineers called reversing the visual signature. They needed to make the compacted surface look uncompacted. They needed to restore, at least visually, the irregular texture of undisturbed ground. And they needed to do it in a way that could survive both close-up examination and high-altitude photography, because neither alone was sufficient. The Germans might send a low-level aircraft for a second look if something caught their attention in the initial high-altitude pass. The team brought in large quantities of soil from the surrounding area, specifically from zones where the natural color and composition matched what was visible in aerial photographs of undisturbed terrain nearby. They were extraordinarily precise about this. Color variations that seemed trivial at ground level were significant at altitude because aerial photography compresses and flattens what you see, and the eye instinctively reads large patches of uniform color as artificial. Natural terrain has slight, irregular variations. The team reproduced those variations deliberately, scattering the imported soil in patterns that mimic the randomness of natural erosion, wind deposit, and animal disturbance. But they didn't stop there. They introduced texture elements, rocks, dried vegetation, clumps of soil compressed into irregular shapes, and strategically placed patches of real grass and brush that had been carefully removed from other areas and replanted. This sounds straightforward, until you realize that every element had to remain in place when aircraft taxied across it. The surface had to look like natural terrain, while simultaneously functioning as an operational runway. The solution was to create what might be called a 2-layer system. The actual functional runway surface remained intact below. On top of it, they created a removable layer that could be quickly cleared when aircraft needed to use the strip and then replaced afterward. This removable layer was lightweight but visually convincing. The grass and brush were mounted on frames that could be slid aside. The loose soil elements were contained within shallow trays that could be rapidly pulled off and stacked at the runway edges. The whole system was designed to be cleared and restored in under 20 minutes by a team of 12 men. The second component was eliminating the shadow problem. Aircraft, even when perfectly disguised from above, cast shadows that can give them away. In Sicily in summer, with the sun at high angles for most of the day, shadow suppression was critical. The team addressed this in two ways. For aircraft that were parked and not flying, they were positioned under natural terrain features wherever possible, tucked against embankments, placed in shallow depressions, or backed under the spreading canopies of the Mediterranean scrub that bordered the field. Where natural cover was insufficient, they erected what the engineers called shadow nets, which were not ordinary camouflage nets. Ordinary camouflage nets break up the outline of an object and make it harder to see directly. Shadow nets were designed differently. They were suspended above the aircraft at angles calculated to eliminate or redirect the shadow the aircraft would otherwise cast. The netting material itself was carefully chosen to cast a soft, irregular shadow that blended with the patterns of brush and rock around it, so that even the shadow of the net was deceptive. The mathematics of this required knowing the sun angle at the likely times German reconnaissance aircraft would be flying, which the intelligence section could predict with reasonable accuracy based on observed flight patterns. The nets were angled and positioned accordingly. For aircraft that were actively using the field, landing and taking off, there was obviously no way to suppress their shadows during transit. The solution here was operational rather than technical. The airfield was scheduled to operate during the early morning and late evening hours, when sun angles were low and unfavorable for aerial photography, and during the midday period when German reconnaissance flights were typically active, flight operations were temporarily suspended. The aircraft were grounded, positioned, and covered. This required coordination with flying units that was not always easy to achieve, but the commanding officer made the case emphatically, and the operational commanders accepted the restriction. The third component was eliminating the activity signatures. This was in some ways the most psychologically demanding part of the operation, because it required changing human behavior on a large scale. People are creatures of habit. They take the same routes, they park vehicles in convenient places, they gather in groups, they leave tracks. All of these behaviors are visible from altitude, and all of them scream organized human activity to a trained photo analyst. The engineers developed what they called a movement discipline protocol, which was essentially a set of strict rules governing how everyone on the airfield moved, what routes they used, where they parked vehicles, and how supplies were moved from one point to another. Routes used by vehicles were varied deliberately so that no single path accumulated the telltale parallel wheel track signatures that revealed roads and access routes in aerial photography. Vehicle parking was rotated constantly so that no area developed the compressed soil signature of a regular parking point. More subtly, the team created what they called false activity signatures at a decoy location some distance from the actual airfield. This was a patch of ground that was deliberately disturbed in the patterns consistent with low-level construction activity, something that would register in aerial photographs as a work in progress rather than an operational site. The Germans, if they found it, would log it as a future threat, something to watch rather than something to strike immediately. This bought additional time and additionally diverted attention. Fuel was perhaps the hardest logistical element to disguise. Aviation fuel arrives in large quantities and must be stored in ways that create obvious signatures. Large fuel dumps, tanker truck patterns, the smell that persists around refueling points, all of these are detectable. The solution involved dispersing fuel storage across a much wider area than was standard practice, burying significant quantities in below-ground storage that had been dug specifically for this purpose, and routing fuel tankers along paths that were varied each trip and treated with the same anti-track discipline applied elsewhere. The underground storage added a significant amount of engineering work to an already demanding schedule, but the team judged it essential. The fourth component was the most technically innovative, and it was the one that the engineers were least certain would work. It involved the use of what they called terrain painting. The concept was simple. The runways and taxiways, even with the removable surface layer applied, had a different radar and visual reflectivity profile from natural terrain. To address this, the team developed a mixture of local soil compounds, crushed limestone, and mineral pigments derived partly from local materials and partly from stocks brought specifically for this purpose. This mixture was applied to the visible surfaces in patterns that matched the color, texture, and reflectivity signatures of the surrounding undisturbed terrain as precisely as the team could achieve. The color matching process involved taking samples from a wide area around the airfield, analyzing them, and then formulating the applied mixture to match the average color profile visible in a high-altitude photograph. The team worked from sample aerial photographs of the surrounding terrain, taken by Allied aircraft specifically for this purpose, and compared their applied mixture against these reference images. The goal was not a perfect match at any single point, but a statistical match across the whole area that would register as natural variation rather than artificial treatment. This required knowledge of how black and white aerial photography captured color differences. This was important because German reconnaissance photographs, like most aerial photographs of the period, were primarily in black and white. Two colors that look completely different to the naked eye might register as nearly identical shades of gray in a black and white photograph, or conversely, colors that look similar to the human eye might register with a strong contrast difference when captured on photographic film. The team had to think not in terms of what they could see, but in terms of what the camera would record. To develop this expertise, the camouflage units had studied captured German aerial photographs extensively, working backward to understand how various terrain types, vegetation, and soil conditions translated onto the film types in use. This intelligence work informed every decision about surface treatment at the Sicilian airfield. Now, 36 hours sounds like a long time, until you map out exactly what had to be accomplished within it. The clock started when the decision was made to conceal the field. The engineers had planned meticulously in advance, but planning and execution are different things. The execution required approximately 200 personnel working in rotating shifts through a Sicilian summer night when temperatures dropped enough to make sustained physical labor possible, and through the following day when the work had to continue even as heat built toward the midday peak. The night shift tackled the surface treatment work. Under blackout conditions, working with shielded low-intensity lights that could not be seen from above, they began the systematic preparation of the runway and taxiway surfaces. The removable layer system had to be assembled in sections, each section sized to be manageable by a four-man team and light enough to be moved quickly when the time came. The terrain painting mixture was prepared in large batches, its consistency calibrated so that it could be applied quickly with brushes and rollers on long handles, allowing workers to cover large areas without having to walk on freshly treated surfaces. The soil imported from surrounding terrain was delivered by vehicles moving on the constantly varied routes, dumped at the edges of the prepared areas, and then spread by hand in the irregular patterns the engineers had designed. Real vegetation, pre-harvested from distant areas, was planted into the loose soil in clusters that mimicked natural spacing. The team had studied aerial photographs of undisturbed Sicilian scrubland carefully enough to understand the typical density and distribution of the native vegetation, and they reproduced it with enough accuracy to be convincing at altitude. The shadow nets were erected over the parked aircraft in the darkness, strung between poles that had been positioned during the previous days. The nets were pre-cut to the specific geometries required for each aircraft type based on the sun angle calculations. Hanging them correctly in the dark required the kind of practice coordination that only comes from extensive rehearsal, and the teams had rehearsed it several times. In different conditions, the engineers were not improvisers, they were systematic, and their systematic approach was the reason the operation worked. By dawn, the surface treatment of the runways was substantially complete. The removable layer was in place across the main landing strip. The aircraft were under their nets. The shadow angles had been checked against the rising sun and found acceptable. The team's commanding officer walked the length of the field and then drove 2 kilometers away and looked back at it through binoculars. What he saw was scrubland. He had to remind himself he knew where the runway was in order to find any trace of it. The day shift continued working on the finer elements, the detail work that would hold up under close examination. They refined the terrain painting where the sunrise light had revealed inconsistencies. They adjusted vegetation placement in several areas where it looked too regular. They added rock and debris elements along the edges of the treated zones to smooth the transition between the disguised runway surfaces and the natural terrain beyond. The decoy construction site was prepared during the morning hours, the team working with open, visible activity in deliberate contrast to the disciplined concealment being applied at the real field. At the decoy site, they moved earth visibly, left vehicle tracks deliberately, and created the kind of organized disturbance that would register clearly in an aerial photograph as active construction. The goal was not to make it look like a finished airfield, but like an airfield under development, the kind of target a German analyst would note and flag for future attention, rather than prioritize for immediate strike. By midday, the camouflage was complete. The field went to its restricted operations mode, flights suspended, aircraft positioned and covered, personnel movement governed by the discipline protocol. The team rested, exhausted, and waited. The reconnaissance aircraft came that afternoon. The crew of the German aircraft, flying its grid pattern over the area, photographed what appeared to be unbroken scrubland. The photographs were returned to the analysis unit, processed, and examined. The analysts saw the decoy construction site, which they noted. They saw the surrounding terrain. They saw nothing that looked like an operational airfield. Because there was nothing that looked like an operational airfield. Not in the photographs. Not to eyes that had been trained to find precisely what the engineers had worked for 36 hours to eliminate. The airfield was logged as negative, no operational infrastructure. That evening, when the German reconnaissance aircraft were on the ground and the risk of observation was at its lowest, the flight operations teams moved out to the runway. The removable layer was cleared in under 20 minutes. The aircraft parked under their nets were readied, and they flew. They flew missions in support of the ground campaign and returned, and the field was restored, and the nets went back up, and the discipline protocols were reimposed, and the camouflage was maintained. This continued for days. The tactical impact of this operation was significant. Allied air operations from this field continued uninterrupted during a period when the Luftwaffe was aggressively targeting Allied airfield infrastructure across Sicily. Other fields, less carefully disguised, took serious damage from German bombing. Equipment was destroyed, runways were cratered, and operations were disrupted at locations that the Germans could find. The camouflaged field escaped all of it. The aircraft operating from it flew close air support missions for ground forces. They flew interdiction missions against German supply lines. They flew escort for bombers operating deeper into the Italian mainland. All of this continued because the field kept operating. And the field kept operating because the engineers had made it impossible to find. But to understand the full significance of what those engineers accomplished, you have to understand the broader context of what camouflage meant at that point in the war, and how the Allied approach had evolved from the disaster of the early years. In the first years of World War II, Allied camouflage was, to put it bluntly, not good enough. The British Army in France in 1940 had used camouflage techniques that were essentially holdovers from the First World War, designed for a ground-level observer and a relatively slow-moving conflict. Against the highly mobile German forces with their sophisticated air reconnaissance support, these techniques were grossly inadequate. The Germans routinely located Allied positions, supply dumps, and concentrations of armor and infantry through aerial photography, and then struck them with devastating precision. The fall of France brutally exposed these deficiencies, and in North Africa, where there was no forest cover, no urban terrain to hide within, and where aircraft could range freely over vast open desert, the limitations of Allied camouflage were on continuous painful display. Rommel's forces in North Africa benefited enormously from Luftwaffe reconnaissance that could spot Allied supply columns and armor concentrations across the featureless desert landscape. The Allies were losing the camouflage war, and they knew it. The response was institutional and serious. The British had actually been developing better camouflage doctrines since the late 1930s, drawing on the experiences of those who had studied the problem in the interwar years. People like Geoffrey Barkas, who before the war had been a film producer and director, found himself in charge of the British camouflage effort in the Middle East. Barkas brought a filmmaker's eye to the problem. He thought about what the audience, in this case the German photo analyst, would see, and worked backward from the desired perception, rather than forward from the available materials. This was a fundamentally different approach from the soldier's instinct to cover things up, and it proved far more effective. Under Barkas's direction, the British Camouflage Organization developed methods that were then shared with American counterparts as the United States entered the war. The American Army established its own camouflage training and development programs, drawing heavily on British experience but also developing new approaches, particularly those suited to the industrial production methods that American logistics excelled at. Where the British sometimes had to improvise with available materials, American supply chains could deliver purpose-designed camouflage materials at scale. The Sicily operation represented the maturation of this combined doctrine. It brought together British expertise in aerial photo analysis and camouflage assessment with American engineering capacity and industrial-scale material supply. The result was something neither nation could have achieved alone in 1940. The specific techniques used in Sicily also drew on lessons from several earlier operations that had proven key principles, sometimes at high cost. One of the most important was the experience at Tobruk in 1941 and 1942, where both sides had extensively used camouflage in a prolonged static siege situation. At Tobruk, camouflage engineers had learned critical lessons about how aerial photographs revealed patterns over time that were not visible in any single image. A German analyst comparing photographs of the same area, taken days or weeks apart, could spot changes that indicated activity, even when each individual photograph showed nothing obviously suspicious. Something that looked like natural terrain in a single photograph might reveal itself as a prepared position when compared against a sequence of images showing how the terrain had changed. This temporal analysis problem was something the Sicily team took very seriously. Their discipline protocols were designed not just to fool a single photograph, but to maintain consistency across a series of photographs taken over time. The terrain had to look the same in tomorrow's reconnaissance photograph as it looked in yesterday's, which meant that every restoration of the removable surface layer had to precisely replicate the previous configuration. The team kept detailed records of exactly how the visual elements were arranged before each clearance for flight operations, so they could restore them identically afterward. Another critical lesson came from the Allied deception operations in North Africa that had preceded the Battle of El Alamein in October 1942. Operation Bertram, which was designed to conceal the actual timing and location of the El Alamein offensive, had involved creating dummy vehicle concentrations in the southern sector of the line, while hiding the real armor concentration in the north. This operation had shown that successful military camouflage was not just about making things invisible. It was equally about creating convincing false pictures of what the enemy expected to see. The enemy's expectations were a crucial tool that the camouflage team could exploit. The engineers at Sicily understood this. They were not simply trying to make the airfield invisible. They were trying to replace the airfield with a picture of something ordinary, something that required no further investigation, something that gave the analyst the comfortable sense of having found what he was looking for and moved on. The decoy construction site served exactly this function. It gave the analyst a finding. It gave him something to report. It satisfied, at least partially, the psychological need to have located something in an area where activity had been reported or suspected. And by satisfying that need with false information, it redirected attention away from the real objective. This psychological dimension of camouflage, the deliberate manipulation of the observer's expectations, and the exploitation of cognitive patterns, was something that the most sophisticated camouflage practitioners of the war understood deeply. They were not simply craftsmen applying paint and netting. They were, in a very real sense, artists of perception management, working to create specific mental states in the minds of people they would never meet. The Germans, it should be said, were also masters of this art. German camouflage throughout the war was often innovative and effective. German vehicle camouflage in particular adapted quickly to different environments, and German engineering units could construct surprisingly convincing decoy positions. But the German military culture, which placed enormous emphasis on offensive initiative and rapid movement, sometimes underinvested in the patient, careful, almost obsessive attention to detail that the best defensive camouflage required. A culture focused on attacking did not always develop the same patience for hiding. The Allied approach in the Mediterranean, refined through the brutal schooling of North Africa, had developed exactly that patience. And the 36-hour operation in Sicily was its fullest expression to that point in the war. The materials used in the operation represent a fascinating catalog of wartime ingenuity. The camouflage nets used for shadow suppression were the product of considerable research and development. Standard military camouflage netting of the period was designed primarily to disrupt the outline of objects when viewed from relatively low angles, the angle of a ground observer or a low-flying aircraft. For the specific application the Sicily team needed, which was eliminating the shadow cast by an aircraft under clear Mediterranean sunlight at the known sun angles of German reconnaissance overflights, standard netting was inadequate. The team used a modified netting system that incorporated strips of material with different reflectivity characteristics woven into the mesh at calculated densities. The denser, less reflective sections were positioned where the shadow would fall to absorb it rather than cast it through onto the ground below. The more open, more reflective sections were at the periphery, creating a soft gradient that transitioned smoothly to the surrounding terrain, rather than creating a sharp edge that would catch an analyst's eye. The specific pattern of this modified netting had been developed through testing that involved suspending standard aircraft under various net configurations and photographing them from altitude at different sun angles to determine what was and was not visible. The terrain pigments used in the painting mixture had an interesting provenance. The base soil compounds came from the surrounding Sicilian landscape, collected specifically because they matched the visual characteristics of local terrain. But the mineral pigments used to adjust the color profile for photographic purposes came from a supply chain that reached back to research conducted in the United States and Britain on the spectral properties of different soil types and how they translated onto the photographic film emulsions in common use by both Allied and German aerial reconnaissance units. This research had been conducted by teams that included professional photographers, chemists, and geologists, working together on a problem that would have seemed absurd as a peacetime collaboration. How does a particular shade of reddish-brown Sicilian limestone appear in a black and white photograph taken through a precision lens at high altitude under direct Mediterranean sunlight? The answer turned out to be a specific gray value that could be precisely matched by combining local soil with measured quantities of specific mineral compounds. The engineers in Sicily had tables and formulas. They were not guessing. The vegetation elements, the real grass and brush that was transplanted to complete the surface texture, had been gathered from areas specifically chosen to match the visual characteristics of the vegetation, visible in aerial photographs of the terrain surrounding the airfield. This was not a random collection of local plants. It was a curated selection, assembled to match the scale, density, and color profile of natural vegetation at specific distances from the camera. Vegetation visible in a high-altitude photograph does not look the way it looks to the naked eye at ground level. Scale and altitude change everything, and the team had learned to think in terms of how things looked at altitude, not how they looked standing next to them. There is a detail about the operation that tends to stop people when they first hear it. The engineers, after establishing the physical camouflage, conducted what they called a verification sweep. One member of the team, equipped with captured German photographic analysis equipment that had been acquired from intelligence sources, photographed the disguised airfield from an altitude matching the typical German reconnaissance aircraft operating height. This was done using an Allied aircraft stripped of markings and operated on a specific route, designed to replicate the conditions of an actual reconnaissance overflight. The resulting photographs were then analyzed by the same team member using German photo analysis methodology, following the procedures that Allied intelligence had reconstructed from captured German training manuals and from the interrogation of captured Luftwaffe reconnaissance personnel. The goal was to confirm that what the Allied team had created would pass scrutiny under exactly the analytical procedures the Germans would apply. The photographs came back. The analyst went through them methodically, applying German doctrine. He found the decoy construction site, which he was supposed to find. He found the surrounding terrain. He found no operational airfield. He reported this finding to the commanding officer. And then, according to several accounts of the operation, the commanding officer walked out to the disguised runway surface and stood on it for a long moment without saying anything. The field he was standing on was invisible in the photographs in his hand. He had built something that didn't exist, as far as anyone looking at those photographs was concerned, and he needed a moment to appreciate that. The operation's success contributed to a broader Allied approach in the Sicilian campaign that integrated camouflage more systematically than had been done in previous operations. The lessons from the 36-hour airfield concealment were written up and circulated through the engineering command, contributing to what became an evolving body of camouflage doctrine that would be applied in subsequent operations in Italy and eventually in the preparations for Operation Overlord. The specific techniques, the removable surface layer, the temporal consistency requirements, the shadow net geometry calculations, the terrain painting methodology with photographic verification, all of these became standard elements of the camouflage toolkit available to Allied engineers. Not every operation could achieve the same level of concealment as the Sicilian airfield. Not every terrain was as suited to the approach. Not every operational situation allowed the restricted operations schedule that was essential to maintaining the deception. But the principles were now proven, and the methods were documented. What the Germans were dealing with in Sicily was not just military pressure on the ground. They were dealing with an adversary that had developed the ability to make significant military infrastructure simply not appear in the intelligence picture. From the German command perspective, this created a particular kind of difficulty. They knew the Allies were operating a substantial air effort. They could see the effects of Allied air operations in the damage to their supply lines, in the close air support hitting their armor, in the escort missions that were keeping their own bombers from reaching Allied positions effectively. But they could not find all the fields from which these missions were flying. Parts of the Allied air effort appeared to be operating from locations that did not exist. This uncertainty had a corrosive effect on German planning. When you cannot locate your enemy's infrastructure, you cannot target it. When you cannot target it, you cannot destroy it. When you cannot destroy it, you must plan on the assumption that it will remain operational, which means you must plan on the assumption that your enemy will maintain air capabilities you cannot reduce. This forces a conservatism in operational planning, a tendency to hold reserves, to plan for worst-case scenarios, that cedes the initiative to the side with the more secure logistical picture. The concealed airfield in Sicily was one data point in a larger pattern of Allied deception and camouflage operations that, collectively, gave the Allied command a more secure operational base than the Germans could identify and attack. The sum of these individual successful concealments was a German intelligence picture that had systematic holes in it, and those holes meant that German commanders were always working with incomplete information, while Allied commanders generally had a clearer picture. The men who built the camouflage, who spent 36 hours in a Sicilian summer applying soil and hanging nets and painting runway surfaces to match the surrounding scrubland, did not think of themselves as intelligence operators. They were engineers. They were solving a technical problem with the tools they had, but the effect of what they built rippled upward through the command structures of both sides in ways that those engineers could not fully see from where they were standing. There is something deeply satisfying about this kind of story from a military history perspective. The great battles of the war, the famous engagements, the named operations, these are the events that fill the histories, and they deserve their place. The courage and sacrifice involved in the actual fighting was real and immense, and should be commemorated. But the war was also won by the accumulation of thousands of unglamorous technical achievements, carried out by people who were not particularly trying to be heroic. They were trying to solve problems. They were bringing expertise to bear on challenges that needed to be solved for the war to go the right way. And they solved them. The camouflage engineers who made an airfield disappear in 36 hours were not dramatic people engaged in a dramatic act. They were methodical people engaged in a methodical act. They had studied aerial photography and color theory and soil science and shadow geometry. They had rehearsed their procedures. They had done their calculations. They had tested their methods and refined them based on what they found. And then they applied their knowledge, worked through a night and a day, and produced something extraordinary. The Luftwaffe flew over it and saw nothing. The airfield flew its missions and kept operating. And the campaign moved forward. One of the aspects of this story that deserves more attention is the intelligence preparation that made the operation possible. The camouflage team did not arrive in Sicily and improvise. They arrived with extensive background knowledge about German aerial reconnaissance doctrine, German photo analysis procedures, German aircraft capabilities, and the specific characteristics of the photographic equipment and film stocks the Germans were using. This intelligence had been gathered through several means. Captured German reconnaissance aircraft had been thoroughly examined and their camera systems analyzed. Captured German photo analysts had been carefully interviewed by Allied intelligence officers who understood what questions to ask. Captured German training manuals and doctrine documents had been translated and studied. And perhaps most valuably, Allied photo analysts had spent thousands of hours studying German aerial photographs that had been captured or obtained through intelligence channels, learning to read German analytical annotations, and understand what German analysts looked for and what they routinely missed. What they learned was sometimes counterintuitive. German photo analysis was in many respects excellent. German analysts were highly trained, systematic, and worked with good equipment. But like all analytical systems, German photo analysis had characteristic blind spots, patterns of attention and expectation that could be exploited by someone who understood them. One of the most important of these blind spots was the tendency to compare new photographs against a reference expectation. An analyst looking at an area that had been photographed before would compare the new image against the reference. If the new image matched the reference, the area was logged as unchanged, and attention moved elsewhere. If the new image differed from the reference, the changes were flagged for investigation. The Allied camouflage team understood this perfectly. Their goal was not simply to make the airfield invisible in a single photograph. Their goal was to make it look consistent with the reference photographs that German analysts already had of the area before the airfield was built. If the camouflaged airfield looked like the pre-airfield terrain that German analysts had already logged and dismissed as unimportant, it would trigger no flag. It would pass through the analytical process unexamined. This was why the terrain research was so thorough. This was why the team obtained and studied pre-construction aerial photographs of the site before designing their camouflage. They were not trying to make the airfield look like generic Sicilian countryside. They were trying to make it look specifically like the particular patch of Sicilian countryside that was already in the German reference files as cleared terrain with no military significance. This level of analytical sophistication represented a significant evolution in Allied deception planning from the relatively crude early war approach of simply covering things up and hoping for the best. By 1943, the best Allied camouflage operations were designed with the enemy analytical process in mind from the beginning. Every element of the camouflage was designed not just to obscure, but to generate a specific analytical conclusion in the mind of a specific analyst using a specific procedure. It was, in the most precise sense, a psychological operation as much as a physical one. The physical work of building the camouflage was the medium. The analytical conclusion in the German analyst's mind was the actual product. There is a parallel here with other aspects of Allied deception in the war. Operation Fortitude, which successfully concealed the actual D-Day landing location by creating the fictional 1st United States Army Group, worked on the same principle. It was designed not simply to obscure the truth, but to generate a specific false conclusion, that the main Allied landing would come at the Pas de Calais, in the minds of specific German intelligence analysts and commanders. The physical elements of the deception, the fake encampments, the inflatable vehicles, the fictional radio traffic, were all designed backward from the desired analytical conclusion. The Sicily airfield camouflage was smaller in scale but fundamentally similar in its conceptual approach. Know your audience. Understand how they think. Design your deception to generate the conclusion you want them to reach, not simply to hide the truth you want them to miss. The men who understood this most clearly in the Sicily operation were those with the art and design backgrounds that the Army had recruited into camouflage work. A film producer or a theater designer thinks professionally about how to create specific perceptions in an audience. They understand that the audience brings assumptions and expectations, and that the most effective way to create a desired perception is to work with those assumptions rather than against them. You do not make an audience forget what they know. You give them something that fits what they know so comfortably that they feel no need to look harder. The German analyst who examined the photographs of the camouflaged airfield and found the decoy construction site experienced exactly this. He found something. It fit his expectations of what an area with military activity should produce. It satisfied his analytical mandate. He moved on. And behind his satisfied conclusion, 22 aircraft and a fully operational runway sat under the Sicilian sun, invisible. It is worth pausing for a moment to consider the sheer physical difficulty of what the engineers accomplished in 36 hours. The airfield in question was not a small operation. It had multiple aircraft, a full complement of support equipment, fuel and ammunition storage, personnel facilities, and the maintenance infrastructure required to keep military aircraft operational in a combat zone. All of this had to be camouflaged. Not some of it, all of it. The runway surface treatment alone covered an area of roughly